Thanks everybody for being here. What an honor to be able to speak with you. And I'm on my way here this morning. I was thinking I was going to talk about what God says about government. In fact, people don't realize that the Bible teaches more on government than it does on heaven. Right? God takes that pretty seriously. God is the one who created civil government. And just like with family government, just like with church government, if you follow his instructions, you get blessings, right? Why did God create government? Well, he told us. Romans chapter 13 tells us the purpose of government is to punish evil. It's not to educate children, not to give you free stuff that they took from your neighbor. It's to punish evil. But when it starts going out, it's just like a fire, right? When the fire is in the fireplace, it's useful, it's good, it keeps you warm, you can cook on it. When it gets outside of the fireplace, you get a disaster. Yes. And that's unfortunately what we're dealing with right now.
Yes.
Do we have this up on the screen? No, we don't. Let me see if we can. So at the last moment, I decided instead I would teach a little bit about the purpose of education, which I believe is a question we all need to be asking ourselves because, unfortunately, we have forgotten the purpose of education. So if I can move this here. And do you guys know, does this go into that TV? I can do it without you guys being able to see the slides, but it'd be nice if you guys could read the Bible verses along with me as we go. Let's see. All right, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Something I've been working on for the last decade. And the reason why I've focused so much on education is because I believe this is the battle where everything else is going to be decided, where we are either going to win or lose on all of the issues that we care about. So does that not work?
Can we go on airplane?
I don't know if we can. No, because this is not okay. Well, if we can't make it work, it's no big deal. I just have some Bible verses and some of the evidence of what I'm saying. But when you think about the purpose of education, the world has its view, and God has his view. Education, I believe, is inextricably intertwined with discipleship. And a lot of pastors, when I started talking about this issue, well, we're just focused on the Great Commission. Right? We're just going to make disciples of all nations. We're going to baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We're going to teach them to obey. That's interesting. If you look at the data from the Nehemiah Institute, where I serve on the advisory board, 80% or more of our Christian children from Christian homes with married Christian parents who spend 12 years in a public school are going to leave the church and they're going to leave the faith. So you're telling me you're going to go make disciples in Zimbabwe and in Laos and in Brazil, but you're going to lose 80% of the young people in your congregation. Interesting. Right? This is an issue that we must confront, ladies and gentlemen. So what is the purpose of education? It's a question a lot like, what is the meaning of life? Depending on how you answer that question, you'll have a very different view on education. Now, Jesus Christ is quoted twice in the Gospels, in Matthew and in Luke. He says, whoever is not with me is against me. So, real clear differentiation here. God has explained to us in perfectly clear terms, there are two camps in this world. There's the camp that is with Christ, and there is the camp that is against Christ. And this applies to individuals, this applies to institutions, this applies to just about anything you can think of. And notice there's no middle ground. It's not like you're either with me or against me, or you're sitting on the sidelines and you're neutral. Right? That's not an option. So let's think about this in the context of what is happening with our children right now. How many people think the public schools are with Christ? There's no infidel on this planet who would make that argument. There's no pagan on this planet who would say, oh yeah, the public schools are with Christ. I don't want to send my children there because they might become Christian. Right? Absolutely not. So the pagans don't send their children to Christian schools, but the Christians send their children to godless and pagan schools. Mm-hmm. And then we act really surprised when 80% of them leave the church and leave the faith. We say, wow, how did that happen? I guess Sunday school didn't do a good enough job. So if we go to the word, Colossians 3, chapter 23 says, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. And this applies to whatever you do, notice, very much including the education of your children. Jesus says in Luke chapter 6, verse 40, he says, students are not greater than their teacher. The student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. So who is teaching our children? You all know who's teaching our children. A godless government that murders babies by the tens of millions and lies to us about it, and then puts people in jail for protesting quietly about the slaughter of unborn babies. Is that the people who should be educating our children? Remember, whoever educates the children are going to be like their teacher. So I'm not arguing that every public school teacher is bad. There are plenty of Christians, men and women in there, but the system is diabolical. Ask any public school teacher, what happens if you tell your children in your classroom about Jesus Christ? They'll tell you real quick what will happen. They'll be out that door faster than if they had committed a sex act. You think I'm kidding? I'm absolutely not. And then we act surprised. My generation, millennials, 70% of us, according to scientific polls, are now in favor of socialism. Okay, this is a poll that was released in 2018. Socialism is the antithesis of Christianity, by the way. God says, thou shalt not steal. They say, well, God didn't realize resources weren't going to be equitably distributed. So we're going to steal everything from everyone, and then we're going to make things fair. Right? On every point, socialism, communism is the antithesis. Even more troubling than that, another poll was released also in 2018. My generation, millennials, for the first time in all of American history, Christians are in the minority. And I should say self-proclaimed Christians. Less than half of the kids or the people in my generation identify as Christians. And when you talk to the millennials, do it, right? You all probably know some. Even the ones who say they're Christian. Well, why are you Christian? Oh, well, mom and dad took me to church when I was a kid. So what does it mean to you to be a Christian? Well, I go to church every once in a while. But do you have a relationship with Jesus Christ? Oh, what's that? Haven't thought about that. So what has happened here, folks, is the largest loss in the church that I know of in human history. And it's not just limited to the United States. It's happened all across what used to be known as Christendom. And the reason why, I submit to you, the primary reason why is that we have not followed God's instructions when it comes to the education and discipleship of our children. It's that simple. So in the Westminster Shorter Catechism, the first question, what is the chief end of man? And the answer, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Well, that applies to education as well. What is the chief end of education? It is to glorify God. Okay? That is what the Bible teaches very clearly over and over and over again. And of course, the Great Commission begins in the home, right? Our first ministry, before you start thinking about sending a missionary to Laos, and these are good things, we need to be doing that. But before you start thinking about evangelizing the world, making disciples of the nations, you have to worry about your first ministry. That's the children that God entrusted to you and your spouse. They're not your children. They're certainly not the government's children. They're God's children. And he has given you 18, maybe 20, maybe 28 nowadays years to work with them and to disciple them. And if you miss that opportunity, what does Proverbs 22:6 say? Raise up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will what? Not depart from it. So what happens if we miss that opportunity? What happens if the enemy disciples our children? Are we going to be surprised when they don't want to depart from evil? When they're aborting our grandbabies and committing suicide and school shootings and drug addiction? I mean, how did that happen? I can tell you how it happened. They have been indoctrinated. They have been discipled by the enemy. Now, God tells us what proper discipleship of our children looks like. He told his people early on in the scriptures. You go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and chapter 11. Twice he explains how you are to educate your children. You're supposed to teach them about God and his laws and his word when you wake up in the morning, when you're walking by the way, when you're sitting down to eat, when you're laying down at night to go to bed. Notice there's no time to hand them over to Caesar for some brainwashing 5 days a week and then get back to the unbrainwashing and then teach them about God. This is an all-day process, right? And that doesn't mean that we can't delegate some of that responsibility as parents, right? It's no problem for us to join with a homeschool co-op, go to church, and share some of those responsibilities with our brothers and sisters in Christ. But to send our children into a spiritual war, and make no mistake, there is a spiritual war raging right now. The Bible teaches it from beginning to end. The Apostle Paul puts it in very plain language. Ephesians chapter 6, you all know the story. We're battling against powers and principalities, the rulers of the darkness and spiritual wickedness in high places. You're going to send your children unarmed and untrained into a spiritual war to be salt and light? Right? Just like you're going to send your 8-year-old to Afghanistan with an M16. No, right? You wouldn't send your children into a physical war untrained and unprepared. It would be ridiculous, and we all see that. And yet we're going to send our children into a raging spiritual war to be discipled by the enemy. It's just simply preposterous, folks. So if you look at the history of education in America, our forefathers understood this for hundreds of years. What I'm saying would not have been new to any of them. It's new to Americans today because we're now 4 or 5 generations deep into this. But 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, everybody would have understood what I'm saying right now. You look at the first education act that was ever passed in this land. long before we had a country. This was 1647 in Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. The name kind of gives it away, right? The premise is actually outlined in the bill. That old deluder Satan wants to keep men away from the scriptures. And so in this colony, everybody must learn to read so that they can read their Bible so that Satan cannot deceive them. That was the first law on education in this landmass called North America. Now, they had a little bit of a different context at that time, right? People were still being burned at the stake for trying to translate Bibles and things like that and preaching without permission. You know, the British government was not very fond of people preaching without license and stuff. But the point remains just as true today as it did back then. Satan wants kids ignorant of the scriptures. So that was our first education law. You go back to the earliest education systems, right? Harvard, the first university set up in America. Believe it or not, it was a good school at one time. I know that's hard to believe today. But at one time, this was a very, very prestigious and incredible educational institution. Here's what they had in their original rules and precepts, just to give you a sense of what our forefathers believed about education. And this is a direct quote. It says, "Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to get a really good job, get a good college degree, make a lot of money, and then retire in Florida." You guys know that's not true, right? The main end of his life and studies, it said in the Harvard Rules and Precepts, is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life. That was the main purpose of education, according to Harvard University. Now it's kind of a joke, right? Their original motto was truth for Christ and the church. They've shortened that now to truth. And of course, we know they don't even believe in truth. So that's kind of an oxymoron there. But and this was true of all our great universities. You go to Princeton, their original motto, "Under the protection of God, she flourishes." In Yale, they had "Lux et Veritas," light and truth. They have Hebrew writing on their crest, on their coat of arms. It's the Hebrew for Urim and Thummim. These are the tools that in Exodus chapter 28, the priests used to discern the will of God. John Milton, in the 1600s, said the end of learning is to repair the ruins of our first parents by regaining to know God aright, and out of that knowledge to love him, to imitate him, and to be like him. So our forefathers, for a long time, understood why we educated, right? If you go back to the very first dictionary in America, I've got it here, let me quote it for you. This was the 1828 Noah Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, the first American dictionary we ever had. If you don't have a copy of this, you should get one. Anytime you're looking at a word and you hear it, you see it in the Constitution, look at the old dictionary and look at a modern dictionary. And I'll do that for you with education right now. So education in 1828 was defined as the bringing up as of a child, instruction, formation of manners. Education comprehends all that series of instruction and discipline which is intended to enlighten the understanding, correct the temper, form the manners and habits of youth, and fit them for usefulness in their future stations. He goes on to say in this dictionary, to give children a good education in manners, arts, and science is important. To give them a religious education is indispensable. And an immense responsibility rests on parents and guardians who neglect these duties. By contrast, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary of today, I pulled this off my library, it's the latest edition. Education is the action or process of education or of being educated. Also, a stage of such a process. Also, the knowledge and development resulting from the process of being educated. Kind of a big difference here, right? So we have become much dumber as a society. Now, I went to Google and I asked Google, what is the purpose of education? Right? Google's where 80, 90% of people go when they have a question. So what does Google say is the purpose of education? I'm going to read it to you. The main purpose of education is to provide the opportunity for acquiring knowledge and skills that will enable people to develop their full potential and become successful members of society. It's word for word what Google told me when I asked what the purpose of education was. And that's interesting. Suppose you were born in Nazi Germany. What does it mean to become a successful member of society? Does it mean you're real good at goose stepping? You're good at rounding up Jews and throwing them on trains? You're good at shutting down churches that won't bend the knee to your golden idol? What does it mean to be a successful member? What if you were born in the Soviet Union? What does it mean to be a successful member of society in the Soviet Union? You're really good at rationing your ration cards. You're really good at snitching on your parents when they have thought crimes. What does it mean? Is this really what we think is the purpose of education? To become a successful member of society? Jesus said they were going to hate us. He said they were going to persecute us. Do we really want to be successful when our Lord and Savior told us the world was going to hate us because they hated him first? Frankly, I'm not impressed with that definition of edumacation. I asked the artificial intelligence, what is the purpose of education? Same thing. The purpose of education is to give knowledge, skills through personal development. It enables children to become successful members of society. It keeps coming up over and over and over again. Well, can we combine the world's vision of education with God's vision of education? You're either with Christ or against Christ. To put a finer point on it, Luke chapter 16 says, no servant can serve two masters. He either will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot combine a Christ-centered system with an anti-Christ system and expect that to work. Okay? So even unfortunately, a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters, they recognize the evil that's taking place. They say, but we're just going to do the same thing, but at church. Or we're just going to do the same thing in our home. We're going to homeschool, and we're going to use the government school textbooks, and we're going to sprinkle some prayer on the top. We've got to reimagine the whole thing, ladies and gentlemen. We have been suckered into buying into a totally fraudulent definition of education. Now, let me see how much time I have left. It's about 10, 15 minutes or so. So the history of this, of how we got here, is absolutely fascinating. I just released a book on this last week. I've got a handful of copies over here if anybody's interested. And one of the things that I do is I trace the history of how we ended up with the system we have today. And virtually nobody knows this. I did a lot of original research. I relied a lot on Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld, who I co-wrote another book on education with about 10 years ago. I think we might have one copy of that. But it begins before virtually anybody knows. It's a guy called Robert Owen. So he was a Welsh utopian. He was an industrialist. He had a textile manufacturing facility in Scotland. And he rejected the Bible. He rejected the truths that God teaches in the Bible. So he didn't believe we needed family. He didn't believe we needed private property. He didn't believe parents ought to be educating their children, which was the norm at that time. Right? Children were primarily homeschooled, and then to the extent that there was outside assistance that came from the church. So he pioneered this idea that we got to liberate the children as early as we possibly can from the care of their parents so that we can mold their minds and shape them into good little citizens. Now, to his credit, he believed passionately in this nonsense. He believed so fervently in this stuff that he bought a big piece of land up in Indiana and set up a commune there called New Harmony, where they got rid of private property and they wanted to get rid of family. And of course, it failed in less than 2 years because obviously if you do things that are contrary to the precepts and teachings and morals that God has revealed to us, you're going to end up with a problem. So within 2 years, the stupid colony had failed. And Robert Owen thought about it. He said, dang, it didn't work. I wonder why. It was such a good idea. I know why. It's because these children were raised in a Christian environment by Christian parents, and they believe these biblical things and individualism and stuff. What we need to do is we need to have government educate these children. Now, that went over like a lead balloon, right? People were not interested in handing over their children to the government. Read your Bible, right? There's absolutely no scintilla of support for the idea that we ought to be handing our children over to the state for education. Again, the purpose of government is to punish evildoers. It's not to educate your children for you. So Americans 200 years ago said, yeah, no, we're fine. Thank you very much. We don't need the government to educate our kids. So he wrote all these crazy essays about how the best government would be the one that did the best job educating children. And these ideas, again, didn't take off in the United States, but they got picked up in Prussia, which was a dictatorship, by the way. And the Prussian dictator, according to Robert Owen, so much approved of the ideas in these essays that he ordered his interior minister, and he talks about this in his autobiography, to create a government school system. It was the first ever system of education of the state, by the state, for the state. And he wasn't interested in creating well-educated citizens. He was interested in creating obedient subjects who, when he said, go die in that war, they would say, yes, master, and they would go die in that war. When he said, give me 50% of your crops, they would say, yes, master, here's 50% of my crops. He was not interested in thinkers. He was not interested in making disciples. He was not interested in any of the things that we normally associate with education, at least normal people do. He was interested in brainwashing and creating an obedient class of serfs. So Robert Owen, his ideas, obviously, they weren't popular in America. And so he set up what a whistleblower later described as a secret society to advance these ideas. Now, the whistleblower is a fascinating guy. He wrote a whole book about this. His name was Orestes Brownson. And he was very much involved in the Owenite movement. He became a Catholic. He repented of his involvement in this thing and wrote a whole book exposing it. It's called a liberal oration, or an oration on liberal studies. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. And he says he knew about this operation because he was organizing a considerable portion of the state of New York for this agenda. He said they had two primary goals on the surface. The first was to change public opinion. They needed to convince Americans that at least we should have the camel's nose under the tent where the government could get involved. Then the other purpose was to get men elected to the legislatures who would support a government role, or at least the camel's nose under the tent when it came to education. And it took a long time to get there. Right? But he says, Orison Brownson says this, and I'm going to quote a couple things from his book because it's so significant. It says, the members of the secret society were to avail themselves of all the means in their power, each in his own locality, to form public opinion in favor of education by the state at public expense, and to get such men elected to the legislature as would be likely to favor our purposes. Okay. Why did they have to do it secretly? Because if they did it openly, they would have been tarred and feathered. What do you mean you want my children? That's crazy talk, thank you. And then he says, the great object was to get rid of Christianity. Why would they want to get rid of Christianity? Because it was a giant brick wall standing in the way of their agenda for building a utopia with no family and no private property and all the rest of it. So this is the history that people don't know, but that people need to know. So the system took root in Prussia. Who's heard of Horace Mann? Some of you might have gone to like Horace Mann Elementary School when you were kids, right? So he's widely regarded as one of the founding fathers of the government school system. John Dewey is the other, and we'll come back to him. So Horace Mann was the first ever Secretary of Education for any state. We had never had any state with a Secretary of Education because, again, it wasn't the government's job to educate children. So Horace Mann comes in, gets himself selected as the first ever Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, and he starts bringing the Prussian ideas to the United States. So we're going to set up public schools, government schools. We're going to tell parents they need to send their kids here. We're going to set up what he called state normal schools, where the government's even going to educate the teachers so that all the teachers would teach the children the same thing. Now, Horace Mann, we know quite a bit about his views. He rejected the Bible. He rejected Christianity. He believed that we should get the Bible out of the schools, which, I mean, it was like an oxymoron to the people that, how could you have education without the Bible? That's the main textbook. What would you teach them if you didn't have the Bible, right? That's crazy talk. So he wasn't able to get that far. He believed that public education, government education, would equalize all men. And he wanted to bring the Prussian system to the United States. Now, he had a very naive and totally erroneous view of human nature, right? The Bible teaches what? Man's heart is desperately wicked. We are sinners. We are born with a sin nature. Left to our own devices, we will do all kinds of evil, right? But Horace Mann thought, no, that's silly, superstitious Bible stuff. People are really good, right? If they weren't brainwashed by all these Christians, they'd be great. He actually said publicly many times that if government-educated children, we could get rid of 90% of all the crimes that were happening at that time. Right? Oh, if he could only see the world today. I don't know if he would hang his head in shame or what, but he could not have been more wrong, right? Crime, of course, exploded in the aftermath of the establishment of government schools. So that's a little bit of the background. Now let's go to John Dewey. Now, John Dewey, you might have been educated at the John Dewey High School, right? John Dewey is a superstar when it comes to education. Anybody in here who's got a 4-year education degree from any government college knows what I'm talking about. He is the man when it comes to public education. And again, we know a lot about what he believed. Okay, we don't have to speculate. He left us a lot of essays, a lot of books. He told us exactly what he was thinking. He went to the Soviet Union, which was butchering people by the millions. And he wrote articles in the magazine called The New Republic about what a great system it was. True. He said he especially liked the schools they had there because they were instilling a collectivistic mentality in the minds of the children. Now, he had some disagreements with the revolutionary Marxists. He believed that a gradual process of building utopia would be better, more effective, and more long-lasting than an armed revolution where the proletariat would eat the bourgeoisie. But he agreed with the same goals. In fact, his model was a book published in 1888 by Edward Bellamy, another very influential socialist at the time, called Looking Backward, about, again, a communist America in the year 2000, no family, no private property, everything was just going to be awesome, right? We'd create the equivalent of the new Soviet man. And so John Dewey wanted to build this in the United States. He wanted to dumb down people. And one of the things that is so fascinating is that he teamed up, he was a communist, right? And he teamed up with a super capitalist, John D. Rockefeller of all people, right? Because they had common interests. John Dewey wanted a dumbed-down, gullible population that he could brainwash against Christianity, against private property, and he wanted to fundamentally transform the United States of America, as we've heard recently from some of our elected officials. Well, John D. Rockefeller wasn't interested in all the social stuff, but he wanted dumbed-down workers who would be good at turning the screw in the factory, who wouldn't start companies to compete with him, who wouldn't be philosophizing about the role of government. They would just turn the screw like they were told to in the factory, and when the bell rings, they'd move on to their next task. So they had this convergence of interests. Rockefeller gave him $3.1 million to start an experimental school in Chicago. They took a bunch of kids, dumbed them down. They graduated kids that couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't tell right from wrong. And they said, this will be perfect. Let's do this across the whole nation. And that's what they did. He went over to Columbia University's Teachers College, which is the biggest, most prestigious, most important teachers college in America, and set about transforming education in this country. He took the architecture that had been laid down by Horace Mann and weaponized it even further. Now, because I'm almost out of time, I'm just going to focus on this one last element of Dewey. And we could talk about Dewey forever. I've got a lot of his books at home. You should read them. It's insane. But John Dewey was also a religious man. People don't realize that. He actually founded what he said was a new religion. Him and 33 of his buddies, mostly from academia, created the Humanist Manifesto. This was the Bible of their new religion. And I want to read you a couple pieces from the Humanist Manifesto. So the very first tenet, and this is a direct quote, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. I mean, it's a free country. You can believe any idiocy that you want to, right? But let's compare that real quick with what God says. Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. They were telling us right at the start of their religious document that their religion was completely, inherently, and totally incompatible with the religion that reigned supreme at that time, and which, of course, the religion that we understand is the truth as revealed by God. Even if you're not a religious person, even if you don't believe the Bible, and you should, your eternity depends on it, but even if you don't believe this has incredibly significant political consequences as well. Our founding fathers, when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, what did they say? We hold these truths to be self-evident. That God created us equally. That he endowed us, our Creator endowed us with certain unalienable rights. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. What happens if you believe John Dewey's religion? Oh, don't be silly. You can't have God-given rights. There's no God. What kind of crazy talk is that, right? So right off the bat, we see that John Dewey's religion is not compatible with Christianity, the religion that created the systems, the institutions, and even the governing documents of our country, and Western civilization more broadly. And it's not compatible with the founding principles that our country is based on, that God gave us rights, government exists to protect those rights, and frankly, he calls them self-evident. These are all biblical ideas. I would argue they are self-evident, but the idea that you have a right to life, where did that come from? It's from the Bible. God said, don't murder. Murder is evil. God said the purpose of government is to punish evil. Therefore, they must punish murderers and help you protect your right to life. God said, don't steal. Therefore, you have a right to property. And if someone steals from you, that's evil. The government must punish them. So these are biblical ideas, reframed by Thomas Jefferson as self-evident truths, but they all understood these came from the Bible. But that's not what John Dewey and his buddies believed. Now, one of his buddies who signed this Humanist Manifesto, C.F. Potter, he wrote a book in 1930 called A New Religion. And here's a quote from the book. Education will be the most powerful ally of humanism. Every public school will be a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday school, meeting 1 hour a week, teaching only a fraction of the children, do to stem the tide of 5 days of humanistic teachings? They knew the answer to that. Pretty much nothing. Right? And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing that Christian education will save your children. Jesus Christ saves your children. But God has given us these commands, and these people understood we're going to capture the hearts and minds of the children using the public school system that we never should have trusted. Now, Dewey and his buddies, they thought they were very original. They thought they were very clever. We are our own little gods. There is no real God. We'll determine for ourselves what's right and wrong. And that's actually the oldest lie in the book. Right? If you go back to Genesis chapter 3, that's what the serpent said to Eve. Oh, you can eat that fruit. Did God really say? He just knows that you're going to be like God, knowing good and evil when you eat that fruit. So this is the repackaging of the oldest lie in the book. Now, they didn't come out and say, we're going to brainwash all your kids with this nonsense. They kind of kept it on the down low. But then in 1962, and I'll stop here in just a moment. In 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court put the final nail in the coffin. They said, the Constitution says you can't have prayer in the schools. Right? Of course, the First Amendment to the Constitution, which they cited, says Congress shall make no law. respecting establishment of religion. When the First Amendment was written and ratified, most of the states had established churches. Do you suppose they meant that we couldn't have prayer in public schools? Of course they didn't mean that, right? But we had already been so dumbed down and so brainwashed that a lot of Americans said, meh, whatever. Kind of like we did when they said you have a right from the penumbras of the Constitution to slaughter unborn babies. Meh, whatever. The Supreme Court says so. So in 1963, they went even further, no more Bibles in the schools. But the guy who wrote the dissent in this case, Justice Potter Stewart, he hit the nail on the head when he said this in his dissent. This refusal to permit religious exercises is not the realization of a state of neutrality with respect to religion, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism. That's what it was. They did exactly what Congress was prohibited from doing. They established a national religion. They forced us to subsidize this false religion from the pit of hell with our taxes. They forced us to surrender our children to be brainwashed into this false religion from the pit of hell with our taxes. And then we act surprised when the fruit of this false religion in the minds and hearts of our children is suicide, school shootings, drug abuse, abortion, collapse of society, revolution, and all the other things that we see taking place around us. And now it's at the point where they're openly, the state education board in California approved a ethnic studies curriculum that literally had the children chanting to the demonic pagan Aztec deities of cannibalism, war, and human sacrifice. But that's how bad it has gotten, folks. We'll leave it there because I'm almost out of time, but I would encourage you folks, we've got to rethink the purpose of education. We must protect our children from this wickedness. Wow. Wow. Wow.